All right, I hope everyone had a good lunch. We have 4 projects left before our discussion. The first project is Rim Buffers for Wildlife and Water, Phase 10, PA06. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Dusty Vanthony, and I'm the CREP coordinator for the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. And with me today, I have Sharon Doucette, Conservation Easement Section Manager for Bowser. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss PA06, Rim Buffers for Wildlife and Water, Phase 10. This request, similar to Phase 9, is not funding for CREP like Phases 5 through 8 were. This request is for a rim-only buffers program, similar to programs we had prior to 2015 that were very successful. The goal of this phase of rim buffers is to increase wildlife habitat in corridor areas by permanently protecting approximately 1,365 acres on 39 rim easements on a floodplain scale. Enrolling these parcels into rim buffers will help create corridors for wildlife that are critical to linking larger habitat complexes while maintaining agricultural landscapes and improving water quality. Phase 10 of the Rim Buffers program targets parcels experiencing flooding, erosion, and sedimentation, resulting in marginal agricultural production. Rim Buffers Phase 10 will include watercourses not required to have a buffer through the Minnesota Buffer Law, and will use technical criteria and conservation practice standards to design and install buffers above the 30-foot minimum, 50-foot average requirement on public waters, enhancing the Minnesota Buffer Law through expanded riparian protection. For removing contaminants from overland flow, the recommended filter strip width ranges from 30 feet to 220 feet and can be extended up to 350 feet if necessary. The required width is dependent on site-specific factors such as soil loss, watershed area, slope of the contributing area, and materials such as sediment, nutrients, or chemicals. For wildlife, research shows that buffers up to 1,650 feet or more may be necessary depending on the species. This phase will continue utilizing a ranking and selection process and be implemented locally by soil and water conservation districts who work directly with the landowners. Bowser did receive almost $4 million from the current biennium from the Clean Water Fund for buffers as a match. This was not included in the proposal as we did not know the outcome of the legislative session at the time the proposals were due. With this being phase 10 of rim buffers for wildlife, we want to give you an update on the previous 9 phases. Buffer phases 1 through 4 are completed and protected over 2,800 acres through OHF funding and over 4,000 acres of riparian habitat through all funding sources. Buffer phases 5 through 8 are being utilized for the CREP program in partnership with the USDA and were funded during the same period that the Minnesota Buffer Law was being proposed and ultimately adopted. The Minnesota CREP agreement between the USDA and the state of Minnesota was approved by both parties in January of 2017, and securing a portion of the state commitment prior to that was influential in its approval. 3 appropriations that made up a portion of that secured state commitment were Minnesota Law 2015, 16, and 17, Rim Buffers for Wildlife and Water. The first batching period for CREP began in May of 2017, which is when we first began securing easements with Rim Buffers Phase 5. If we fast forward from 2017 till now, our most recent batching period for CREP ended on July 2nd, and after selecting easements for funding from this batching period, there's roughly $190,000 remaining in landowner payments from buffer phases 5 through 8. The balance of the appropriations are for payments to local soil and water conservation districts for the work completed and for the restoration work on those easements. The most recent status updates do not include the easements from the last batching period because it ended after the updates were due. As was mentioned at the beginning of yesterday's meeting, there are a few amendments that are proposed to Minnesota Law 2015, 16, and 17 as a result of CREP interest in counties with higher land values and changes in federal leverage. And we'll be talking to the council about this in a couple months. There were recent changes made to the CRP rental rates this spring and summer, and that the average of our last batching period, the federal leverage on our last batching period per application was around 3 to 1. This same time last year, the average was around 1.58 to 1, federal to state leverage. The funding for Minnesota Law 2021 was for buffers phase 9, and enrollment is expected to begin this winter on that program after requirements are finalized by the appropriate Bowser committees and the board. Much like phase 9, phase 10 is not tied to CREP and will be a RIM-only program. Feedback we've received from local soil and water conservation district staff regarding the need for a RIM-only buffers program allows us to believe that phase 9 and 10 will be utilized in a timely manner due to a backlog of interest of land not CREP eligible due to practice limitations. And there are over 213,000 acres of CRP expiring between 2022 and 2024. Just as an example, the 2014 buffers program was a RIM-only program, and that sign-up resulted in $37 million of applications. Again, we'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and we'd take any questions you may have.
Questions? Dudley?
You mentioned matching funds that weren't included. I didn't catch that number. What was that number again?
Almost $4 million from the Clean Water Fund.
Okay, thank you.
I struggled with something that was in your proposal, and I want to read it to you, and then you can tell me what it means, because it confused me terribly, and maybe I was alone. The Minnesota buffer law requires a modest buffer area on roughly 50% of these riparian areas, but does not follow technical design criteria, accommodate flooding issues, and allows continued disturbance of these areas not favorable to wildlife. Can you explain what you were trying to say there?
The lands enrolled or lands put into buffers under the Minnesota buffer law, they are allowable to be used for hay or other activities. Lands enrolled under the RIM easement program have a more permanent protection, and while management is allowed, it has to go through the management, operation and management plan for each easement.
And I would add, Sharon Doucette, easement section manager. The buffer law does not apply to all of the waters in the state that we can apply a riparian buffer area to. The math at the time that the law was passed was that approximately 50% of the waters that could have a riparian buffer on them do not fall under waters that are required by the buffer law to have that buffer. And again, the buffer law requires 16.5 feet on public ditches and a 30-foot minimum and a 50-foot average on public waters. And that does not meet the technical standards that Dusty referenced, depending on things like slope and the erodibility of the soil, and what the landowner's goals are for putting in that riparian buffer. 30 or 50 feet might not be nearly big enough to handle the resource concern.
Thank you, I think. Anyone else have questions? Great, thank you very much. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Next, we will move to PA07, Northern Tallgrass Prairie National Wildlife Refuge, Phase 8.
Okay, you got it off easy, 3 times fast.
I'm not going to do 3 times fast because we know what that will lead to.
All right. Chairman Hartwell and members of the council, I appreciate the opportunity to present our proposal to you today. I'm Ruth Thornton with the Nature Conservancy, and I'm the program manager for the Northern Tallgrass Prairie National Wildlife Refuge Acquisition Program for TNC. It's a mouthful, I know. I'm joined today by Scott Gloop from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Scott is a project leader of the Litchfield Wetland Management District and has worked with us on this program for many years. As some of you may be aware, this refuge is located in western Minnesota and in Iowa and was established in 2000 to permanently protect native tallgrass prairie, of which less than 1% remains in Minnesota. To date, the refuge has protected nearly 13,000 acres, and funding from this program alone has protected 7,150 of those acres, more than half, and has been instrumental to the success of the refuge so far. When deciding on which properties to include in the program, we consider a number of different factors, including how much native prairie is left on the property and if it is located in a priority area identified in the Prairie Conservation Plan. Another major factor is the connectivity of the parcel with existing protected lands, and if the Minnesota Biological Survey has identified any populations of threatened, endangered, or rare species or vegetative communities on the property. We use these and other factors to vet every submitted parcel to ensure that only the highest quality lands that will significantly contribute to prairie conservation will be included in the refuge. The focus of the program is both fee and easement acquisitions of high-quality native prairie. We have found that this is a good mix of providing both the recreational opportunities such as hiking, birding, hunting, and fishing, since all fee lands acquired with this program are open to the general public, while also keeping some of the land in production as privately owned haying or grazing lands, which helps support the local community. A portion of the funds are also used for restoration and enhancement work on any parcels acquired under this program. While the focus is on acquisition of high-quality native prairie, small areas often need enhancement or restoration to control invasives or woody encroachment, or to restore small areas of cropland to native species. We are now requesting funding for the 13th phase of this program, and I would like to first give you a brief summary of our accomplishments so far. To date, we have protected about 7,150 acres under this program. More than 6,300 acres, or 88%, have been either in a prairie core or corridor of the prairie plan, and more than 4,200 acres, or 59%, are native prairie. And more than 3,500 acres, or 49%, have been ranked as moderate or higher biodiversity significance by the Minnesota Biological Survey. And from a funding side, we have now completed all acquisitions through the Minnesota Law's 2017 funding cycle, and have currently spent on 46% of the ML 2018 acquisition funds. Additionally, we currently have signed agreements in hand that we expect to close by mid-November, and those will spend down the ML 2018 funds completely, plus 38% of acquisition funds under the ML 2019 round. We are currently in active negotiations with several additional landowners. If all of these negotiations were to be successful, they would spend down 74% of the ML 2019 acquisition funding. And it has been a busy year for us so far. Since submitting the proposal for this grant back in May, we have closed on 3 properties totaling 370 acres. And we just actually had another closing last week. I would like to stress how important continued funding is to the success of this program. Negotiations with landowners who own high-quality native prairie can take many years, even decades sometimes, and we need to be able to wait until they are ready to sell, given their own personal and financial situations. Continued funding gives us the flexibility to hire experienced staff who can work with private landowners over the long term and to ensure that as soon as the seller is ready to work with us, we are able to move forward with the acquisition. We are therefore requesting funding for another round of this program, which would enable the protection of an additional 1,900 acres, including more than 1,000 acres of native prairie, to be added to the refuge. So I have just given you an update on the accomplishments of prior funding rounds. And now Scott will talk about a particular project we worked on together a couple of years ago that is a good example of the importance of building long-term relationships with landowners.
Good afternoon. I'm calling an audible here. We just got an email from some landowners we worked with, and it was a closing last week that you mentioned. And this landowner just, because I'm short on time, I'm not going to get into all the details, but it was, he had to convince his siblings to work to save the prairie portion of this land, and they sold it as a northern tallgrass prairie tract. And he just sent a thank you. And in that thank you, he visited last week that land again after the closing and sent some pictures of some of the native plants on that. And I can't read all of what he wrote, but I'll read just a small portion of it. Sometime when I visit this land in the future, I hope to once again see western meadowlarks. I remember them sitting on the fence post, singing their hearts out when I was young and on the land. I know I've done right by myself, my ancestors, the land, and future generations. Another little audible is last week I had to make an unexpected visit to the eye clinic because I had a chunk of metal in my eye that needed to be removed. And after the doctor took it out, and it wasn't my regular eye doctor, he leans back and he says, "Scott, I don't know if you remember me, but a few years ago, you stopped by as my son and I were leaving a tract for duck hunting, and my son had shot his first duck." And I said, "I remember that well. That was on a northern tallgrass prairie tract in the Litchfield Wetland Management District." And he went on to share that he said, "I don't know if my son was more excited about shooting the duck or how excited you were to have an opportunity to share that experience with him." He went on to say he'll never forget that, and he was so excited about how you went on and on and on about him getting his first duck and how you could remember when you shot your first duck. I don't know how much time I have, but I want another landowner story. About 15 years ago, one of my staff came to me and said, "Hey, I know a fella that owns some land in northern Candioi County. It's got some beautiful prairie on it." And I said, "Well, set up a meeting." So we met at the Hilltop Cafe near Spicer. And this individual owned a farm equipment place in Redwood Falls. And he had obtained this land recently because a good buddy of his had bought it for hunting, and his buddy got cancer and died and made arrangements to make sure that Pat got this land. Pat knew nothing about prairie. So we met, and we had lunch, and we talked about how nice the prairie is on his land. He says, "Well, let's go look at it." So we went out there. It was a beautiful day, and I'm walking the prairie with him, showing him all the different plants. And he doesn't know any of this at the time. And at one point I said, "Pat, if you don't mind, I just have to lay down. This is such beautiful prairie." So I laid down right there on top of the hill. Well, we kept working with this person. We used our Partners for Fish and Wildlife Service program to remove some trees from the prairie while he owned it. We restored a couple wetlands that had been drained, and we kept a relationship with him. And at one point he says, "If I can find some land closer to home, I'd like to do a 1031 exchange, and I'd be interested in an offer." A few years later, he found some land. He called us up, says, "I'm ready for an offer." I'll never forget the day we were sitting in Perkins in Wilmer with Linda, one of the realtors with the Nature Conservancy, and we chatted with him for a little bit, and then Linda opened up her folder, turned it around, pushed it to him, and it was the offer. He looked at it for a fairly short period of time, and he looks up at Linda and he says, That's a fair offer. And then he looks at me and he says, Scott, do you remember the first time we went out there and you laid down in the prairie? I said, yeah. And he says, I decided right then and there, if I was ever going to sell this land, it was going to end up being Fish and Wildlife Service land. So those are the things at the end of my career, and if I'm ever laying on my deathbed, that I'm going to remember about these kind of things. And it's special. There's a lot of human dimensions involved in these land acquisitions. And this land is important to these people, and it's really important to knowing them in their future, that it's going to be saved for future generations. I'm done. I think we're ready for questions. I'm sure I'm over my 2 minutes, Mark. Sorry.
Scott?
Still stuck on your eye there. How is your eye?
It's still, I had the protective lens taken out of it yesterday. I had to go back twice last week because I didn't get it all the first time. So moral of the story is, if you're grinding on something, don't wear protective glasses. Put goggles on, because it's still got behind the glasses somehow. And I'm thankful that there are people that can take metal out of your eye, because it's not fun.
Any questions? We're glad you're looking at us. Thanks for your work. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next is PA08, Martin County DNR WMA Phase 6.
Good afternoon, Chairman Hartwell and council members. It's a great day to be here to testify on behalf of PA08, Martin County DNR WMA Acquisition Phase 6. I am Doug Hartke, Grant Coordinator for the Fox Lake Conservation League of Sherburne, Minnesota. Within our partnership for this grant, our club works with the Conservation Fund to assist us with all real estate portions of all land acquisitions, and Ducks Unlimited to help with the wetland and grassland restorations. Here with me today is Emily Nelson to my right, Associate Minnesota State Director with the Conservation Fund, and to my left, John Lindstrom, a regional biologist with Ducks Unlimited. Our partnership continues to work well with the Minnesota DNR and add important WMA additions to the existing Martin County habitat complexes. The map that was in your packet shows the parcels that are in our acquisition radar to add to the WMAs of Martin County. Currently, the Minnesota DNR has less than 3% of land base in Martin County. Our club works with the Minnesota DNR to proactively determine the most ideal additions and roundouts to the current habitat in Martin County. We are a local grassroots organization and know our county landowners and our county habitat very well. We will have county support of any land acquisition. The Fox Lake Conservation League is a local club with around 400 members, and we've been very active in the past, as this is our Phase 6. I am very pleased to announce that our first grant is 100% spent. Our 2018 and 19 grants are 98 and 94% spent in our acquisition budgets. Engineering, bidding, and restorations of the 4 parcels in these 2 grants will begin this fall. Our 2020 grant has 2 purchase agreements pending and a 3rd parcel we are pursuing at an auction in 2 weeks. Our 2021 grant contracts have just been executed, and we are now working on our parcel list with the Minnesota DNR. We are also very active in the DNR CPL and ECP programs and annually use approximately $60,000 of match for these programs. The additions of these public lands have been a great boost to the Martin County public hunting lands. We have great county support from our county commissioners. Our club hosts an annual youth waterfowl hunt, working with the Minnesota DNR and Minnesota Ducks Unlimited, hosting approximately 12 area youth each year. We are also currently working with the Minnesota DNR and an Eagle Scout candidate to place a handicap-accessible deer blind on a recent acquisition. I would like to thank the council for the past funding and continued support for our project. We are truly making a difference for conservation in Martin County. Thank you. Here next to testify is Emily Nelson with the Conservation Fund.
Thanks, Doug. My name is Emily Nelson. I'm the Associate State Director with the Conservation Fund. And I wish every county had a Doug Hartke to do this type of work, because the DNR, we originally, back in 2015, I'll rewind time for just a second, but there were a lot of interested landowners in Martin County on this map who wanted to sell land to become part of the WMA program. And I don't know if you've ever been to Martin County, but if you jump out of an airplane, you could pretty much land on a restorable wetland basin. So we needed to get serious on how we targeted these acquisitions. And back in it was winter of 2015, all of the groups that work in conservation in Martin County got in a room with a digital whiteboard and shape files, and everyone got together with laser pointers, and we made these complexes that day and discussed what are the actual threats that the wildlife and the habitat are facing in each part of the county. And I was surprised to find that they were different threats. Some of it was conversion of habitat, like draining wetlands. Some of it was, this is a great area to harvest prairie seed. Some of it was, we're tracking Blanding's turtles up in this part of the Perch Creek WMA area. So it was very different throughout the county, and there were different needs. And the reality is, we are never going to have enough money to buy all the land to protect it. So we need to get creative on which ones do we need to own and fee, which ones can we work on with CRP, which ones can we do easements with RIM. So what you see in front of you on that map are the complexes that were chosen by everyone working in Martin County, which had a great message, because now we could communicate to the county board, here's our actual plan, here's what we're doing, here's what we're looking to do, and it really has resonated very well, especially when we do our burger nights down in Martin County. We bust out the map and we can show everybody, here's what we're planning on doing. So it's a really good groundwork. And the Conservation Fund, so we are real estate experts, and we can bring our expertise to Doug, who has a 9-to-5 job. This is what he does for fun. But we can actually come in and bring some of that, our real estate prowess to the table. And Doug, you know, he lives with the landowners on this map, and their kids go to school together, and he is the one on the ground who funnels us the acquisition opportunities that are in these complexes. So it's a really great partnership, has been for the last 5 years, and just want to thank the council for your support for the last 5. And I'll turn it over to John Lindstrom now.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, members of the council, my name is John Lindstrom. I'm a regional biologist for Ducks Unlimited. Pretty much all of southwest Minnesota is my current boundary. So they work on the front end, and then I work with the DNR on the back end to restore these things. And it's really fulfilling work to take marginal farm ground, in many cases with a lot of drained wetlands, and restore it back to a really nice prairie pothole complex. You heard Doug mention earlier that we've really hit the ground running with the past appropriations, and this fall, hopefully this week, we start bidding our first wetland restoration project for one of the Martin County program acquisitions. I think it's 10 wetlands to restore, about 50 acres, which is a pretty substantial amount of wetland acreage to restore. We're also actively leveraging the acquisition cost with federal NACA dollars to bring additional money to the table to help us pay for these restorations. And it's really cool where we have this really targeted approach, because the complexes are so important for what we want to do. And we're building complexes of a size that are self-sustaining and can really provide habitat to the animals that need it most, in an important part of the landscape continentally for ducks. So with that said, I think we're ready for any questions if anyone has any. Thank you.
Any questions? Ron?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Doug, you've been a familiar face here for quite a few years for the new members of the council. Tireless working on behalf of your project in Martin County. I always like projects that involve local people like yourself, local sportsman's club. What I'm astounded by, perhaps astounded is a little strong, but Martin County commissioners haven't put one nickel into this, at least in this project that I'm seeing before me. And they go, if Martin County is such a, you mentioned cooperating with you, doing everything, patting you on the back perhaps, but they're not reaching into the pockets of the county residents who are going to enjoy this the most. Have they been asked for money, or have they said no, or haven't you asked them?
Chairman Hartwell and Ron and other members, at this point, I guess I haven't seen a lot of other conservation groups put the match up. So we've used our match on the CPL program and the ECP program. So I haven't went to the county board asking, just haven't followed suit with anyone else to try that. Not saying that I couldn't, but I never have.
Can I add to this? Well, I would just say, Doug, I'm just speaking about myself here. I'm more moved if more local people are putting their money on the line to get something done. I would certainly suggest you go before your county board like you've gone before us and say, hey, you got to chip in on this deal, because that gives me more incentive to chip in on your deal.
Other questions? Good enough. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you all.
There are some turkeys right behind Ron there too that came for the show.
Yeah, we planned those.
They follow me.
Our last presentation today is PRE 01, DNR Grassland Enhancement Phase 14, a real number. I don't have to interpret. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Dear Chair and Council members, thank you for the invitation to present today. My name is Greg Hoke. I'm the Prairie Habitat Supervisor at the DNR. Typically, Judy Schulte would be here with us. She was unable to be here today, but I have Scott next to me, who you're all familiar with, and I will let him tell one of his stories when I get done here, specifically about the fire program. I also want to thank Sandy, as always, for putting me after Neil, because Neil covered most of what I wanted to talk about. So Ruth, please pass that on to him. Just to give a brief history, we've been spending down our past appropriations and accumulating acres, both restored and enhanced on our past appropriations. We've wrapped up ML15, and even though we did get an extension on ML16, we're making good progress, and we hope to get that knocked off here fairly soon. For the 17 through 20, we feel like we're both spending down our money and accumulating acres in a fairly linear fashion so that we'll meet all of our targets. One thing we're especially proud of, I know on our status updates this last year, our ML17, our target acres were 30,000 acres, and so far we're at over 45,000 acres. Today, we're here to ask for roughly $10.4 million to do restoration and enhancement on approximately 64,000 acres of protected grasslands in Minnesota. One thing before I jump into this, one of the things I do want to talk about that came up yesterday a little bit was just the collegiality among the grassland groups. I think it speaks well within Minnesota to the conservation community, but within the grassland, I think we're especially close. You've all heard about the Prairie Plan. We all work together. We all talk together. I'm emailing, texting, calling Fish and Wildlife Service friends, Nature Conservancy, Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited on a fairly regular basis. Talking to my colleagues in other states, this is intangible, but I think one of the great strengths we have in Minnesota, in addition to the Outdoor Heritage Fund, is we play really well together. I talk to friends in other states, and the feds don't get along real well with the state. The NGOs are always kind of nitpicking at each other. That doesn't happen in Minnesota. We all work really well together. We divvy up the jobs, et cetera, et cetera. Just again, another example to give. A couple of weeks ago, it got shut down because of COVID, but Minnesota, we were going to host the Prairie Pothole Joint Venture. And just to show you kind of the role that Minnesotans play, Neil Feakin is the co-chair of that 5-state joint venture. Tom Cooper with the Fish and Wildlife Service sits on the executive board. Matt Holland with Pheasants Forever. Pat Rivers, my supervisor. Marshall Johnson, who's technically on the wrong side of the Red River, but he's given presentations here before. And then Marissa Allring with TNC and myself are on the technical committee. So just again, another way that Minnesota has a really strong presence in the conservation community. We work well with each other, and we also have a strong role in larger regional efforts. Again, as you've heard before from several others, grasslands continue to be the most threatened habitat in Minnesota. Thanks largely to your efforts, we continue to build that public land base. The funds that we're asking for here today are to keep those acres in the highest possible quality. So first off, we're requesting $6.6 million for contract enhancement work. This includes hiring local contractors, pumping money into small businesses in rural Minnesota, and also includes working with our federal partners, the Fish and Wildlife Service, who will use these funds to bring in what they call fire detailers from outside of the state to help build our capacity within the state. Every few years, we ask for funding for contract support. These are the staff that line up the contracts and get the contractors paid and are critical to our efforts. Just as a reminder, we are not requesting roving crew funding in this round. This will be my first time not requesting it. During this fiscal year, we are currently spending down our old funds, and then we'll be using the new, what I'll call the new roving crew funds with the new model starting next year. So one aspect of this proposal or this request that's new is a restoration and evaluation monitoring specialist. We intend these to be basically the analogs to the Shallow Lakes program that Ricky has talked about in the past. We now have a decade of restorations that are all different ages, planted in different years under different weather conditions, and planted with different techniques. In the spirit of continuous improvement, these positions will thoroughly analyze these restorations and track them through time. This will allow us to learn from these past efforts and improve our techniques in future restorations. This will basically, what it will allow us to do is collectively answer Mr. Scherer's question on who does the best restorations and what method is the best. The outputs for this effort, we will simply measure and enhanced acres restored as well as monitored. The outcomes will be healthier grasslands that produce more game and non-game wildlife, improved pollinator habitat, and because we're talking from my perspective, we're also going to maximize those ecosystem services, carbon storage, groundwater recharge, water filtration, et cetera, et cetera. These outcomes will benefit all Minnesotans, not just those interested in wildlife and wildlife habitat. They are also not at the expense of wildlife or habitat. They are in addition to what we like to call stacked benefits, although we need a less wonky term for that. With that, let me pass it off to Scott, who can tell you about some of his experiences in the last couple years with the fire detailers we bring in with the Fish and Wildlife Service.
You know, I'm always either the second or last person, and Mark has to show me the 5-minute and 2-minute sign. I think I'm going to talk to my partners in the future and ask to go first. But anyway, I don't have a real story to tell this time. I'd just like to kind of give you an update. I've testified in the past how important this funding is for us to get detailers in. The number one land management practice we use on wetland management districts that we do ourselves directly is the prescribed fire program. And as you all know, that's quite challenging in many, many different ways. And staffing is one of the biggest challenges. So this has been really, really critical for us to be able to bring in folks, fire experts from outside of Minnesota each spring to help us during our core period to get our prescribed burning done. Unfortunately, in 2020, we didn't do any because of COVID, but our fire folks really, really worked hard to try to put together protocol and establish ways to get prescribed burning done under those scenarios, hoping that we wouldn't have to operate in that scenario in the spring of 2021. We did, but we put everything together, and I can't speak for every station in Minnesota, but last spring was one of our most successful prescribed fire years ever at Litchfield. We got more acres done last spring than all but, I believe, one other spring in all the years we've been doing it. And we couldn't do this without these detailers we bring in. Not only does it give us capacity on those fires that are complicated where we need a lot of folks, but oftentimes it allows us to split into 2 crews that day and go get multiple WPAs burnt versus possibly just one with one crew. So our part in this general grant is fairly small, but for us, that small part is pretty important. So thank you.
Any questions? Well, you gonna do any fall burns?
Probably not. It's, as you can imagine, and I think you knew that said that in jest, this year, for the last month and a half, I've been down to less than half my normal staff because all my staff are qualified and they've been all over the country. I've never in 30-some years of doing this seen a year like this year where they're begging for anybody that's qualified to go out and help on all the wildfire problems we have. So literally, I've been down to a third of what I normally have for staff the last month and a half because as soon as our folks get back, they do their required 3 days rest, put their name in, and usually if they put the name in that morning, by noon they're picked up already and being ready to shift off to another fire somewhere. So it's been a real challenging year, and frankly, when my fire staff all do get back, and it probably won't happen till late fall, even if they did get back soon, I think I wouldn't even want to ask them to. They just need a break. These folks have gone through a lot. We did have 3 Fish and Wildlife Service people burned over about a month ago in Montana. And they all survived, and they spent some time in the hospital. I don't know the extent of their injuries, but those folks work hard out there, folks, so you can be thinking about them because they put in a lot of time and effort away from families and doing hard work.
Good enough. Thank you very much. Council members, we have on our agenda next program updates, but I think I'd rather move to council discussion and then go to program updates, Sandy, if that's all right with you. So I just open it up for discussion on any thoughts anyone had on what we heard today, or any thoughts you had about what we saw yesterday that came to you while you were staring at the ceiling at midnight. Is it too cold and everyone just wants to go? Sure, Ron.
I'll start. Just a few thoughts. The proposal to acquire that land next to the boundary waters bothers me. I think the main reason now is I think we've been forewarned by the legislature earlier. If we keep buying land in northern Minnesota, there could be a revolt, and I'm not sure that the land in question up there is worth the risk. You know, we're bombarded with these magic words about development, it's going to be threatened, etc. Or this is going to be a great land for the public to use. Well, then I'm sitting there thinking, well, the boundary waters alone is 1 million acres, and who knows what's outside of the boundary waters that's open to the public. How much do we need? And I don't think they made a case that it's threatened in that sense. But nevertheless, I'm just concerned that we could throw the baby out with the water here. If the legislature decides that we're not controlled or controllable with the acquisition of land, especially in northern Minnesota, could have repercussions that would go to southern Minnesota, where we actually can demonstrate a need for public land there. So that's a concern of mine. Another one that was a concern is Camp Ripley. The general and I are good friends, but nevertheless, for several years now, I've started to wonder what are the benefits to Minnesotans for this, because very little of the money has gone or opens up any land for the public to use. And so we had a discussion afterwards with a nice lady that was so enthusiastic, and interestingly, I posed the idea that we have a walk-in area program in Minnesota, and she told me, yes, that county just was added to the list where they can have public walk-in program. And I said a great idea would be to take some of that land that you've didn't acquire but you have under your control and add walk-in areas to it. She loved that idea, and so who knows? But anyway, I have wondered over the last few years. It started off as we're going to get a buffer for Camp Ripley, but then it just sort of kind of expanded into something that seems to know no end. Anyway, that's enough for me.
Other thoughts? Ashley?
Ashley Peters. I guess I'll just throw this in the pile that each year that I do this, I get a little bit more fuzzy on what is a park versus what is primary purpose of habitat, especially when it's close to an urban area. The recognition that there needs to be a mix of metro area habitat and outstate, but being curious what's the line between a park versus typically what we fund, which is primary habitat work. So there were a couple on this list that made me wonder that again. So I just wanted to voice that I still struggle with that a little bit.
Jamie?
Jamie Becker-Finn. So first of all, I think of it more of a Venn diagram where every park is not necessarily a habitat project and every habitat project isn't necessarily a park, but I think that there are times where they can be one and the same, partially it just depends on who owns it and what they decide to call it. But, I think a lot, especially, on the legislative side, these dollars are paid by literally everybody in our state, everyone who visits our state, all Minnesotans pay for this. And so, if you look at sort of the dollar amounts for some of those ones that people maybe, the comments that were made today and yesterday that they were a little squidgy about, it's like, well, I don't know, if 10% of it is going to things that are more wildlife, not necessarily big game focused, but those kind of projects, I think there's a huge benefit in that as far as the general public supporting the work that we do overall. You'll see just in the comments we make, we all talk about the ones that we know and the areas that we're familiar with. And so I think the more more people who see those legacy signs and like connect that the Outdoor Heritage Council isn't just about, you know, and no offense, obviously I hunt and fish, but like no offense to our like hook and bullet groups. But, you know, I think the more people who see this work as belonging to them too, that's really important in the success of this fund and this council overall. So I do think it's a balancing thing where certainly you wouldn't want 90% of the funds to go towards things that are in more developed things with more pressure and, you know, not necessarily open to firearm hunting or other things. But I don't think I've been thinking a lot, the more I do this, I think a lot more of like the bang for our buck, as far as, you know, you think of what it takes to support a prairie chicken versus what it takes to support any other animal. And I don't think we can simplify it to that degree, you know, like fewer people hunt for this species, but it's more rare and it needs more support than like a white-tailed deer might need, or, you know, it's just all of that balancing stuff I feel like this job gets more complicated the longer I'm here, because it isn't as simple as, I like fishing for tulaby, let's do that. You know, it's not that simple at all. And a couple other things I just wanted to note is that I did have an opportunity to talk to the folks from Lake County after they kind of gave their little speech, and got some clarification that, you know, it was not clear to me from the testimony that was given what they were actually saying. And so I pressed them a little bit to be I'm a straight shooter. Just tell me what it is that you're actually saying. And the bottom line is they don't want that land to be protected. They want it to be developed. And, you know, sort of whether that's, we take the end all be all of what the local government's preference is for a property and what we decide to do. You know, to what Ron was saying, I can tell you on the legislative end, if the legislature doesn't like a specific project, they're not going to tank the whole bill. They just line item out the ones they don't like, or you know, I think our role here is to do the right thing and to sort of follow that guidance and not be worried about what we as legislators are going to do, because it gets tinkered with every year, and council members who've not served in the legislature get angry about it every year, and it's just like the nature of the way that this works. And so I don't think the concern of throwing the baby out with the bathwater is I don't think you have to worry about that with any of these projects. If something comes up and the legislators who serve on those committees don't like certain things, then those things won't make the cut. And I think that happens every year. But again, you know, when I have my legislative hat on, I go back to what does the Constitution say about whatever it is that we're working on. And so, you know, I think just grounding ourselves in that and not sort of letting the outside politics or chatter influence our decisions too much is the best way to go, in my opinion.
Scott?
First, I'm wondering, I feel like I'm in South Minneapolis with the landing patterns just having changed here. I came out here to get away from that. What she said, so I don't have to repeat it. But new subject, Scott Dibble. I'm back to wondering and thinking about a subject that I raised yesterday, which is the whole supplement and supplant conversation, and and maybe, Chair, you can take me offline and we can have this discussion, or Mark or Sandy, we can have this discussion. You know, when we first debated whether or not to put the legacy amendment on the ballot, a number of my colleagues, including Tom Bach and others, opposed it pretty strenuously because they thought, well, you know, we should be doing these things anyways. And the argument against that was, no, the reason we're going to do legacy, particularly in the natural resources arena, you know, arts and culture aside for a moment, is because it's time limited, 25 years. And if we don't move more aggressively than the legislature and the executive branch has shown a willingness to, so much of these lands are going to be developed. And so we're under time pressure. We need to jump ahead and we need to acquire these lands for conservation and preservation and, and for future generations' purposes, or it's going to be gone. Well, I was already inclined to support the amendment, putting it on the ballot and encouraging people to vote for it. I found that to be pretty persuasive. I think it's probably a pretty good bet that we'll renew it, but that's a different discussion. What I'm hearing a lot in these presentations are a lot of program types of activities, operations, and not activities of a capital nature, acquisition, one time, et cetera. So I'm just struggling with and thinking about how we think about that subject. Maybe it's moot, it is what it is. I live in the real world, of course, people go where the money is, but I do worry about letting the legislature and the executive branch off the hook, and I also worry about creating a large enterprise that then needs to be fed and maintained over a long period of time. And are these the dollars that were envisioned to do that? I mean, we were heard quite specifically today in a presentation, but for the ongoing dollars to do this repeated operational type activity, we wouldn't have this beautiful thing that we created. So that's what I'm thinking about. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I think it's a great discussion. There is no doubt in my mind that because of the legacy funding, you and your colleagues collectively have de-emphasized some aspects of environmental funding. And it is really hard to draw the direct line, but the indirect line is pretty clear. And I think it's unfortunate that this isn't completely additive, that it's a little bit of replacement, but it's probably the nature of the beast on some level. I think the thing that I struggle with even more than that is seeing how some of the proposers are creating proposals to sort of permanently add staff. And I don't know if that's supplementing or what it is. We obviously had the one discussion yesterday on the project that it was very clear. They're adding a staff person within a program to do a whole bunch of things not related to that program. But the rest of it is more cloudy. And you heard it, and I don't mean to pick on TNC because I'm fond of what TNC does, but we're going to have our program staff in place whether you fund us at 50% or 100% because we need that staff to keep things rolling. And on what level is that supplanting or substituting or what is appropriate? And the flip side of that, frankly, is if you don't have the capacity to do this work, you won't get the work done. And so on some level, you're sort of funding in advance the work that's coming. And it's a conundrum. I don't honestly know how to address it. If you waved the magic wand and said, Mark gets to make these decisions for $138 million and he's accountable to nobody except himself, he would be having discussions with organizations that would say, I'm not going to fund this part of this and I am going to fund that part of it. And it would be easier to do that. It's really hard to do that in a group, in the kind of discussions we're having, in the time frame that we have. And I think we just have to ultimately feel like we're not being taken advantage of and it's for the better good, Scott. I mean, that's my, having watched this for a long time, we've got to allow some slippage because the ultimate better good that we're involved in here is dramatic. What we're doing in this state with this funding is looked at nationwide as something that is truly amazing. And you look at think of what would happen if none of these projects were funded. If the money went away tomorrow, what would the state look like in terms of our natural environment? And our job here is to prioritize one over the other, and we're all going to have different opinions about that, which one's more important, but just think about none and where we'd be. So it's a rambling answer to your really good question, and I don't know how to really answer your question is my response, which was very helpful to you, I'm sure.
Well, part of the answer, of course, is, is to build the will among the legislature and the executive branch to take this gift and then take responsibility for it. So, and to understand that, we're creating, whether through fee or easement, a lot of holdings that imply a lot of ongoing responsibility. We don't just acquire things and they just sit there. Obviously, we have to do burns. We have to, continually maintain and manage those natural areas, and that has an implication for the budget of, primarily DNR and Bowser and others, and that should be acknowledged. That that a corresponding budgetary plan should follow through then, originated by the executive and then supported by the legislature. But of course, nothing happens in a vacuum. It only happens through the priorities and the pressure and the organizing and the movement that gets built around allocating those resources. So it's a kind of a larger conversation we have with, or, maybe we go out and when we renew, we acknowledge that, maybe we drive the resource up a little bit and acknowledge that it's not just about preserving what might disappear in the next X number of years, but maintaining and bolstering what we have. It's a thought.
Jamie.
You gave me some things to think, Jamie Swenson, you gave me some things to think about there. I'd really like to get an answer to the question that you posed, which is what do we do about staff and the people to do the work? I go back to the intent of the bill and the intent of the people that voted for it, for the amendment, and the money is to be spent on the projects on the ground. It wasn't for the people and the overhead and everything else. It was for the actual projects on the ground. And something that you just said is definitely sticking in my mind about if you don't have the staff or the resources to do it, then you don't ask for the money. I don't know what the answer is, but I really would like to try and find an answer, because in the past it's been allowed, or it's been the idea that a percentage would go for staff, but now we're seeing yesterday and today full-time positions being added as part of the money, and so it's something that I'm definitely struggling with, and I would like an answer or a solution there, but I don't know what that looks like.
I'm just thinking out loud, and COVID has made our lives really difficult to have these discussions. It is so nice. It is so nice to see everyone and spend this time, even though we're shivering today. But having a session specifically around how to address that issue, a discussion of ourselves, not necessarily as we're doing the work we're going to do in the next month in terms of allocation, but really big picture thinking might be really interesting. And I'm not sure we can do it effectively by Zoom. But we should do that before we get to the next year's allocation so that we can, or even request for proposals, so that we can provide guidance as to what we're expecting of people. And I'm seeing a couple other heads nod, so Mark, if you can remind us that we're going to do that, we will do that.
I just wanted to pick up on Ashley's concerns about parks, because I've struggled with it too. Mark mentioned it yesterday. But this is a park preserve here, so maybe the answer is to add preserve to the end of the name, because it's very humorous. As we're in a park preserve, we had flocks of wild turkeys all around us. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are a few deer were over listening to our gobbledygook here. And they didn't seem to be too bothered. But I also have, in fact, yesterday I decided that one of these, was this a park? You know, is this a park? As if a park is a dirty word. And but I guess my perception of a park is picnic tables, and kids' playgrounds, and et cetera, which I don't think maybe that's what we were assigned to protect. But a park preserve, like here, certainly is a tremendous amount of wildlife habitat here. If I was asked to purchase this or secure it or preserve it with Lessard-Sams money, I'd probably be all in. So maybe the answer is take one at a time. There is no hard and fast rule.
Tom?
Ashley, I started out thinking probably you're questioning as you have. But what I find interesting and love to support around the metro, the 7-county metro in particular, are the rivers. You know, we've got the 3 rivers, and somebody's over on the St. Croix, and you know, in Washington County, and I think those are truly habitat opportunities for us, and we're doing it. Birds for sure.
Ashley?
Yeah, I think where I'm coming from is the perspective of what source of funds should pay for a particular piece of property, because there is funding specifically set aside for parks and trails, right? So I get a little fuzzy on what's the line between what should go more parks and trails funding versus specifically for habitat. So anyway, but I agree with everything that's been said. It's a mix, and you have to take it one by one, but
I think when it becomes confusing, go back to the constitutional language. You know, and look at the project and the parcel in the light of what the constitutional charge for us to follow is. And we're all going to interpret that slightly differently because language is flexible on some level, but it's really good guidance as to how to think about the projects. Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to piggyback on and reference a couple things, I was gonna start with how I look through this, the perspectives or the lenses that I look through these proposals and apply my logic. And the first one is I'm really keyed into reauthorization in what that's going to look like, and I get it, that's not off for another 10, 12 years. I sat in the commissioner's office at the DNR, deputy commissioner, for 8 years. And I will tell you, we didn't have these kind of resources. And at that time, I spent most of my time
we were cutting budgets. We were cutting budgets and having to make decisions on personnel and the thought of being able to go out and do a SharpTel project or additive to what we were currently doing at the agency, we didn't have that luxury. And so I sit here and I look at this and I get so excited about listening to all these different organizations and the evolution that has occurred. I said this yesterday, I don't think the legislature saw when they funded this, or when they put this at the voters and the voters voted on it. And I think in large part it was DNR is gonna get a bunch of this, Bowser will get a bunch of this, maybe some of the groups, but I don't think we envisioned the volume of organized effort, coordinated effort, because we hadn't seen that really before. I mean, talking about the prairies and 11 people belonging to a meeting quarterly to talk about their projects and how they're going to deal with them out on the prairie landscape, that's not state government. That's not government. That's the evolution that's occurred. And that's a wonderful thing. It's a little scary thing, and from kind of a DNR, my old DNR hat, I'd be like, okay, how are we gonna get a handle this? But I'm so excited about what this has been and where this is gonna go. But I also recognize when the discussion of reauthorization comes, it's not gonna look like this. The debates that rage, whether it's fee title acquisition versus easement, that's going to be part of that debate. Talking about regional, where there's no money going to be spent in the north versus the west. There's going to be a lot of discussion, and I don't believe it's going to look the way it's going to look today. The legislature will restructure this package if it goes forward. And I'm not totally believing that it'll go forward, but I put it through the perspective of when I'm gonna go through these, I'm gonna do it through the perspective of reauthorization. And I wanna make sure that the projects that I recommend and the dollars I recommend are bulletproof, that there are not a question that everyone, legislators, whoever, sit there and go, yep, know what that is, yep, know what that is, yep, know what that is. Kind of like how I did today, sitting here, and yesterday, listening to, I know programs doesn't sound sexy. I get that. But it's not any different than had they come in, whether Nature Conservancy came in or TPL came in and said, here's our project for the year. And it's gonna be these 10 acquisitions. They're just packaging them. They're presenting them as programs because 15 years ago, we were talking about, we gotta develop programs. And it's just kind of how the evolutionary cycle goes, where we're talking about programs 15, 20 years ago, now we got programs, and now we wanna bring it back to projects. I don't think it's gonna look any different. The stuff that these guys are doing on the landscape are specific to that postage stamp, that landmass that they're working on. They're doing that work. And it might be Pheasants Forever doing it, but they carry the logo of pheasants, and we're talking pheasants. But the habitat that they're developing is habitat that's going to work across species. And that's what really kind of energizes me. The other perspective that I put through here, the other lens is, the chair talked about it, read the Constitution, is fund integrity. I got that drilled into me as when I was chair of the Finance Committee, fund integrity. And at the DNR, that's a big thing. When you're buying license fees for hunting, that money's gotta go to hunting. If it's fishing, it's gotta go to fishing. If it's cross-country ski pass, it's gotta go to cross-country ski pass. Fund integrity is really a big deal. At least in driven into my psyche. And so when I look at, I pulled up the language, the constitutional language, and so it was a third to clean water, a third to, so we've got an equal amount of money that we're spending or recommending to the legislature to spend. There's an equal amount of that dollars being recommended to the legislature on the clean water side of this, of the Outdoor Heritage Fund. Then you've got parks and trails are getting a big chunk of money. And so to the parks debate, I don't have a problem spending some of this dollars on parks if it's a habitat project. When I look at some of these projects, and whether it's Chaplin Park, St. Paul, Rogers, I don't dislike any of them. I think they should get some resources and those projects go through. But when I look at it and see that we're putting it, it's basically a park in a neighborhood, there's a chunk of money that was set aside for state parks, metro parks, rural regional parks, and maybe they can't access those funds. Maybe that's going to have to get addressed in the future. But there is funding mechanisms for those unique things. I've been hard, not necessarily here, but on some of the groups when they're talking about habitat or WMA acquisitions in the metro area. Okay, I've seen the WMAs in my community. They're nothing but parks now. They were great. I shot my first turkey on a WMA just outside of Stillwater. There's nothing in it now. And that's because it's a community park and people are out there walking their dogs and they're out there taking evening walks, and the constant conflict with nature and people, that's not a good habitat mix. So I'm really critical of spending lots of money in the metro area. And I get it. I understand the logic of Metro's paying the bill, they should get to see some of the projects, and they should. But I think we need to have a real critical eye at what that project is then. Is it gonna stand the test of time? Is it gonna maintain its habitat for wildlife, or are we funding a park that's not a bad park, not a bad thing, just to your point, should have been funded through something else, because that's what it's going to inevitably be. And to some of the other points, like I said, I want a bulletproof proposal. I don't want it to be questioned. And maybe I'm not provocative enough. I've never been accused of not being provocative enough at the legislature or doing things at the agency, but maybe as I'm getting older and my wife says a little more cranky, I'm becoming a little more conservative in my approach. But folks, I see what these guys are doing. I see what it's happening out there. And I gotta tell you again, I'm so excited about what this has done, even though I don't believe we've recognized it yet. We're gonna start seeing the benefits of this on the landscape. The landscape is gonna start, as you heard, it takes, to make a prairie or to get a prairie restoration really good and healthy, it takes 5 years, 6 years. We're just starting to see that. And as these projects roll out further, the benefits are gonna be there. But I'm struck by two things. So as I'm prioritizing my dollars, and I hope you think about this too, in the prairie pothole region, we only have 10% of what we have. In the prairie pothole region of the state, only 10% of those wetlands, if I heard DU this morning correctly, 90% of the wetlands in the prairie pothole is gone. And only 1% of our native prairie still exists. Not that I'm not gonna put money in other areas, but that's where I'm hoping to see a prioritization.
So, thank you. He pointed at me.
I
so
pointed at you, it's just fine.
Jamie Becker-Finn. I don't know that this is a counterpoint, but just an alternative view, is that if we increase the amount of these types of public lands that were more accessible to people in the metro, then they would be less concentrated in the places where they are. Because as it stands right now, you know, you're sort of, so if you're me and you live in Roseville, and I don't want to go walk on the Central Park Trail around the lakes and see all the grandmas and the strollers and the paved whatever, you know, I want to be more out in nature. Well, here are my options. And I have to imagine there are other people like me sitting in other parts of the metro area where we know that's where the bulk of this money is coming from and the bulk of our Minnesotans live. And we all end up driving to the same places because those are our only options that aren't, you know, 2+ hours away. So I wonder, you know, if you actually increased investment in creating more wild spaces within closer distance to the population centers. And I feel the same way when I see projects. I think it was last year we had the project in Moorhead or Mankato and some of those areas. I think about it the same way, where people are more dispersed instead of everybody going to the same, like I can tell you with the, you know, as we're looking at CWD or the other sort of things we're dealing with, like everybody goes to Whitewater and everybody goes to Carlos Avery, everybody in the cities goes to Carlos Avery for their turkey hunting and goes to Whitewater for their deer hunt, because there just aren't the options that don't involve owning property up north or spending a lot of time and effort in going that far. And so I'm not saying I have the solution, but it's just, that's sort of the way I think about it, is that, like, to me, that means instead of saying, oh, let's invest more of these funds in the metro, to me, it actually sends me the opposite message, where I think it's even more critical that we get more of those spaces so that folks can be, there isn't that pressure. And that's what I was trying to get at yesterday with one of my questions about the pressure issue. Because to me, we should be, and I would hope the DNR would start thinking about, like, why don't we prioritize, or somewhere in the calculus, you know, it isn't just about an equity and access issue, but in terms of, well, now we've lifted the pressure a little bit on some of these places because there are more of them to spread folks out over. So no easy solutions for sure, but that's sort of how I think about it. And I think of my duty, you know, to my constituents and my role here as well. It's it's hard, but I think, you know, if we're looking at, and again, if your point of view is towards reauthorization, again, I think it's just really critical that we increase the number of Minnesotans who connect the work we do on this council and the dollars we spend that are recommended from this council towards things that people actually know. I mean, I make the carbon and the, like, climate argument all the time, that even if I never visit the northwest corner of the state, that the things we do there matter because it is better for the whole ecosystem, it's better for us climate-wise, but at the same time, you're just not gonna feel connected to the things that you don't, you know, I can't force you to feel connection to a place you've never been, so it's a challenge.
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Representative, I don't disagree with you. I don't. Because I see that void, and I recognize it, but I also got to look back at what I'm charged with, and not the way I want it to be, but with the way it was set for me to look at this. And the language is in my reading of the Constitution, it's pretty clear. People aren't mentioned, maybe wrongly, but it's about fish and wildlife habitat. That's what it's about. And how can I prioritize these dollars, recommending them to be done in the best, most efficient way, and with the assumption that it's not going to be reauthorized. I want to make sure that I did the best that I could do for the habitat of Minnesota, because it may not get another 25-year crack. And I know what the capacity is at the agency to fill that void. Without it, it's not there.
Tom?
Well, I'll share, Tom Sachs, I'll share the yearly frustration or conundrum or whatever you want to call it about the fact that, I'll use an example that today we had 10 projects that were at least $10 million, and should we be given, there's certain merits that are better than others, but should everybody get $2 million, or should we do 5 projects and fully fund them? And every year we think about that. We really don't do anything. And I'm just always interested to see if anybody has any new thoughts on that. Mark, you kind of said it, but
Jamie?
I'll give you my thoughts on that. I've always kind of tried to divvy it out amongst the projects that met the intent of the amendment, and I'm looking at it a little bit differently this year, looking at what has the biggest impact. And I get that it's 1 acre prairie is 1 acre prairie, but who's doing it maybe the most efficient or the best way, has the most partners involved, has the most fingers into the communities and such. And so I think this year, as I go through and do my final assessment, I'll be putting more zeros on there and putting more money towards some of those other projects to really get them the kick that they need to make more of an influence.
I think the thing I'd add to that is look at what money is left from prior years and ask yourself, is it most important to fund this year? What happens if they get less or none this year? Will they stop their work? Which would allow you to put more priority in areas that need more money. It's part of the whole sort of messy process of figuring out how to make the best decisions. And it's actually why, as a group, it's great to do this, because we all see it a little differently. And that means that collectively we'll come up with a better thing than any one of us trying to do it by ourselves. Mark?
Mr. Chair, to that point, last year staff actually had that updated. We updated the previous.
Just wait.
Oh.
It's coming. Sandy's waiting to tell us. Ashley?
Ashley Peters. Yeah, Jamie, to your point, I will admit that one thing I think a lot about is if an organization themselves comes to us and they're basically asking for 1/5 of the money that we allocate, I'm going to prioritize one of their projects over the other, because if they didn't do that before they came to us, then they're basically putting it to us to make that decision for them, which one is the priority. So that's one thing that I've been taking into account and trying to basically, within organizations that ask for multiple projects that are in some cases tens of millions of dollars, I try to temper that a bit, because we do, at least for me, I want to see as much variety as possible, but also recognizing that some of those organizations really do bring a lot of stability and consistency that is nice to see, but also, a 1/10 or a 1/5 of the money, in my opinion, should not be going to one organization.
I think the other thing to recognize is that to some degree we're being played.
Really?
That's a conundrum.
People are asking for more than they can probably spend, understanding that they're not likely to get it and they'll be cut down. And you have to ask yourself, how much do you think any organization can effectively spend, and how does that blend with the other organizations? Not necessarily what they asked and thinking of a percentage of that, but really there are some requests that came in that could spend everything effectively, and others that it just doesn't make as much sense. And we each will take that differently, but that should be part of our thinking. Dudley?
I'm just gonna say, I appreciate Ron pointing out that, you know, proposals that come with matching funds, how important that is. I mean, as a newbie, something that I might have overlooked, but now I realize, you know, that an organization that's willing to put up some of that money, to me, deserves more of, their proposals deserve a lot more of my attention than folks who come with proposals and they have no money, or they're looking for us to pay for everything. And it's like, well, that's not a good idea. So I feel like knowing that now really helps me look a little closer at proposals, so I appreciate that.
It's interesting, Colorado's fund that's somewhat similar to ours requires a match from everybody. Doesn't matter who it is, and if there isn't a match, you can't apply. Which is something we talked about in the early days and was rejected. But maybe it's time to visit that. And the question then becomes, for a government agency, where do they find the match? Sometimes, because they're not like Nature Conservancy or Trust for Public Land or Martin County Protection League. I didn't say that right, but the NGOs have more ability to do that. But it's worthy of a discussion, and it does influence when someone has skin in the game, how you think about it. Any other thoughts that anyone wants to share at this point? Kristen?
Yeah, I would just say leverage is definitely important to me too. I won't say that I'm going to zero out a project if they don't have leverage, but it's more likely. And I know last year I did give zeros to more projects than I had before, and I plan on doing that again. It's just too hard to give them a minuscule amount of what they're asking. So I think prioritizing makes more sense.
So with that, Sandy, you want to answer Mark's question for us? It's actually on the table in front of you if you looked at your materials.
As you may know, projects report to staff twice a year on accomplishments and spending to date. The spreadsheets in front of you is showing accomplishments and spending through June of this year. And I just want to emphasize again that these spreadsheets are a snapshot in time, and actually just since I did this data pull, we've gotten 6 reports, final reports submitted since the time of this. So I just want to emphasize that it is a snapshot in time. And I also want to say that the percentages of funds and acres accomplished do not tell the entire story. And in fact, for example, if an acquisition program is 6 months from losing their availability of appropriation and they have, only 10% of their acquisition dollars spent, you might think they're not accomplishing anything. But when you read their status update, they may have 10 parcels that are ready to close in the next 2 months, and they're going to get it all spent. So I just caution that the metrics don't always tell the entire story, and I've tried to be better at putting specific notes in the side column to kind of tell that story better. And I just want to remind members that acquisitions have 2 years to commit a parcel and 3 years to close on that parcel, and then they have an additional 5 years after the closing to get the restoration enhancement work done. So it's not uncommon for projects to be open for 7 or 8 years while they get this done. One thing that's new this year that I tried to improve on with these spreadsheets was the indication of IDP monies. And in several situations, we have managers that are continually on the list with their appropriation as being open, when the reality is they are only working on one significant restoration project that keeps that appropriation open, but their project is basically complete. So I tried to do a better job on the spreadsheet to indicate those projects so they weren't popping up so they weren't popping up and looking like they weren't getting anything accomplished. So I hope that that is a clear representation of program progress this year. One other thing I will say is, and this was a data miscalculation, is if a program only has IDP money left open, they were able to streamline a status update, in which case some of those projects showed up as 0 being spent on this multiple colored spreadsheet. So please use the spreadsheet that you were handed out today, because this has been updated to reflect that data omission. And I guess I just want to, in particular, point out the Cannon River Headwaters Habitat Complex project, because they had IDP open in 4 appropriation years that showed as 0, and that's not the case. They are actually done with all those programs for the most part, and actually have their 2018 money almost all spent as well. So I didn't want them to be misrepresented by our streamlining of the IDP reporting process. Overall, I would say that I don't have any concerns with projects not getting work done or not being able to spend their funds. Anything that stands out, I try to put into my staff memo. And I know with all of the carry forwards that we've had, that there was some concern that we're going to see this slowing down of spending money, and I would say that that is not the case. In fact, I felt like more stuff got accomplished this last 6 months than I felt I've ever seen in a 6-month period before. And this is kind of a new summary, this spreadsheet that kind of shows how much has been spent out of the bill totals and accomplished in each appropriation year. And I really didn't see anything that stood out as being unreasonable or, slow to spend. And I think that that's all I have. If anybody has specific question or concern about a program, I'm always happy to get an email, look into it, give you some more detailed information about that program. But I guess that's all I have to say.
Any questions for Sandy? I would just say thank you for keeping track of this. This is a massive project for anyone who underestimates it. I just encourage you to go sit with Sandy for 2 days and listen to all the phone calls and all the back and forth. It is truly a massive task, and we appreciate it. With that, we'll move into the allocation process itself, and Mark has a few comments. Mark has a comment before that he wants to address regarding Bowser.
Yeah, I just want to bring your attention, in your packets, actually last night we received a memo from Director Jaski of Bowser, and that's in your packet. And it relates to, I think it's further information that he wanted to make sure the council had with regards to the status updates and where Bowser sits. In that memo, it mentions at the very end of it, it mentions a document with further detail that was sent to me and to staff on July 9th. I have attached that memo for you. It's a 14-page memo with some of the information that really more relates to what we're going to hear from Bowser next month. And this was not, I was not going to send it to you because it relates to next month, but also because it says draft in it. And that's why it wasn't sent to you previously. It's not in my knowledge, it was not a complete document nor to be forwarded. So I just wanted to call your attention to that. But because his memo today does mention that, I attached it for you. For your digestion, and that's all I had on that.
All right. So allocation process here. The first order of business is really to decide what our target allocation number is. And there's a memo in your packet. It's agenda item 6, which I think was yesterday actually, but we're getting to it now. The long and the short is that we're being told we have a balance of $350,000 that will be available in FY '23. The question becomes, what kind of a reserve do we want to operate with? Under statute, we have to have a 5% reserve. We have opted to have a slightly larger reserve because of complete unknowns with COVID. And the importance of this, for those of you that are new, is if revenue ever fell short and there was an appropriation that was underneath the amount, that the amount collected was underneath the appropriated amount, it takes a legislative action to then take money away from someone, which is a really messy, ugly process we never ever want to be in. So 5% was a target, it became a requirement, and then we used a little more, and the recommendation was 6%. There's enough information floating around that revenue is going to be better or COVID is going to get worse that I don't think we have a clue. And I think 6% is probably a pretty safe number for us to use. The difference is we would go from 140 million to 139 million. So it's not a big difference. And I would just recommend to you that we use the 139,690, which represents 6% of the target number. Jamie, as our treasurer, what do you think?
Thank you, Chair. Jamie Swenson. Last year we looked at the historical allocations and the reserve summary, and just so that I had some background, because I was new to it a bit, and in 2016 it was 5%, after that 7%, did 6 for 2 years, and then 10%. And so I'm very comfortable with the 6% that you're recommending.
You need a motion.
Yeah, do you need a motion?
Sure, I need a motion.
I'd make a motion for the 6%. This, Kristen Eggerling, sorry.
But we appreciate the second. Any discussion? All in favor of using the 6% reserve number, which would give us 139,690,000 to allocate with, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. With that, Mark, do you want to cover what staff needs from us next?
Sure, Mr. Chair. Actually, if you wouldn't mind, I'll turn it over to Joe. He can just explain this spreadsheet a little bit for people, if you wouldn't mind. And folks, while he's getting that together, Joe had provided a spreadsheet for you each. It's this bluish one with the yellow top. And on the back, the second page, you can see the 138,130,000 highlighted in yellow down at the bottom. I think actually that was in yesterday's packet. And it'll be coming to you also via email. We can get that out again tomorrow, so you've got it.
With a slightly different number.
Actually, the number will be, I'll let Joe hit that.
All right.
Yeah, Mr. Chair and members, so I'll be sending you a spreadsheet either tonight or tomorrow. And the spreadsheets, the only cells that you'll be able to fill in are the ones that you're supposed to fill in. So you can't change any of the formulas or anything like that. So it's all gonna auto-populate for you. All you have to do is enter your numbers and it'll do it all for you. And then send us back that, let's see, what day is that due? I believe it's this Monday, September 13th at 4 p.m. So hopefully that you guys can do that. And then once we get all those, we'll tally it up for the next meeting and we'll have the nice spreadsheets for you for the next meeting. With this number, we have a few set costs in there that'll come down from that total allocation. So you have a little bit less to allocate. We have the O1 restoration evaluations, that's 200,000. We're gonna have that as a set cost in there. The O2 contract management with the DNR, those are the contracts where DNR oversees and manages the contracts to the NGOs after they get the money, and that's 300,000. Then we have 7,000, or maybe it's, then we have 7,000 to the LCC. That was approved in last year's bill, but it comes out of this year's funding, and that's for the GIS and website. And then we have 553,000 this year for the admin budget. So all the 200,000, the 300,000, the 553, and the 7,000 will come out of that total allocation, the 6,000 or the 6%. So,
which is why it'll be 138,630.
Yep, it'll be really close to that. So that's the, if the number is not the same, that's why. It's because that's included in there. So, and again, on the right side of that spreadsheet, you can see the percent of the request, how much you're giving to them. It'll automatically populate so you can tell right away where it is in the state, and that's based on the percent of the budget in the funding category and not the acre outputs. We thought that was the best way to do it. So if a manager had 100% or 50% in prairie and 50% northern forest, and their request was, or you're going to give them 10 million, it would show 5 million for each of those, and it'll automatically populate. So you can just look and see, make sure, like what Chair Hartwell had said yesterday, if you like the way things are looking. Yeah, it's just a quick way to tell how this would be allocated if the project managers were to spend it as they had asked for the money right now. So if there's any questions, you can call, email. We've gone through this a couple times, so it should work. If there's any glitches, let us know right away so we can get those fixed, but there shouldn't be any.
Thank you, Joe. So the process, Dudley, since you're new, you're the only new person sitting around the table. Josh isn't here. Oh, Scott, you haven't done this either. Wow. You're not the only new person. We each are going to be asked to allocate the 138 million as we would as individuals. And then that will get put together as a blended average. And your chair and co-chair will look at that and make a recommendation as a starting point for our discussion in October as we go through the process. And you can either accept that, you can tear it apart and start over. You can say, I like this one, but not this one. Let's change something. Depending on how it comes out in the averages, we may fully allocate or leave something for discussion. It has varied, the results have varied enough that the answer of exactly how we do this varies. But everything's on the table when we get together in October. All we're going to come to you with is a recommendation based on what everybody collectively has suggested. It is absolutely fine to fully fund a project or to give them nothing. You don't have to sort of feel an obligation to fund anything. So, as you go through this, think about, where would you prioritize or not prioritize? And everybody has a different way of doing it, and there's no right or wrong way. And it is the collective wisdom that we're looking for here. And it is amazing how the collective wisdom seems to actually get to the point where we're pretty close at the end to being comfortable with what has been collectively thought about. So that's our process, unless you want to change the process right now, and we can do that because we're in charge. Kristen, did you have a?
I just Kristen Egerling. I just wanted to ask about CPL. I know she had asked about bumping it up to 500,000. Is that like for next year, or would that be now?
That would be for the appropriation that we are working on, not past stuff. And thank you for bringing that up, because one of the things we can do with all of these recommendations is say, I like this part of the project and I don't like that part. I don't like their acquisition part, but I like the restoration part. Please put that in the notes. I can't tell you how important it is to write down what you're thinking if you think that would be at all helpful to anyone else, so that when we get together in October, we actually think about things beyond numbers. And one of those will be a discussion on CPL. Do we want to increase to 500,000 and the project ceiling at $1 million or not, or increase one or not the other? Those are discussions we still need to have. And if you're uncomfortable with a personnel budget, write it down so that the group gets the advantage of knowing what you're thinking, and we can potentially talk about it and either agree or disagree as a group when we make our recommendation to the legislature. And it looks like I just confused Tom, so.
No, and Kristen, thank you for bringing that up. So the total we have, though, that she gave us is not the total that has the increases.
There's the total that she asked for, which was $9,450,000, is what she wanted. What she wanted was a change in how much she can give any one project from that total.
But that total is correct.
The total is correct.
Okay.
Scott?
Yeah, I got a little confused during her presentation. Didn't she also advocate that eligible projects could be larger overall?
Yes.
Than they are?
Yeah, so currently there's a ceiling on how big a total project can be, and then how much money they can ask for CPL. She was asking for an increase in the total project and an increase in what CPL can do. And we can think both ideas are great, one idea is great, or no ideas are great. It's our recommendation. And we will talk about that when we get together in October. But put your notes down. If you like it or hate it, put it down.
David, will the October meeting be a Zoom or hopefully like this? But bring your snow shovels.
Ashley's wrapping a blanket around her. I fear it will be a Zoom meeting. Please, Mark, if you have a better suggestion.
Mr. Chair, if it's okay with the council, what I'd like to do is get a hold of the Senate, because there's a potential that the Senate would allow us a room at the Capitol where we could have a hybrid meeting. So those who could attend could be there in person. At the time, I would think we'll probably have mask mandate since it's in the Capitol building and with cases the way they are. And then those who would not like to attend in person could attend via Zoom. But it's up to the council.
Would that be preferable?
There will be a caveat to that also. We will take, we've been already told that if we can get that reservation, we will take second fiddle to any legislative business. So if a senator says, I want that room for business, we will be out and we'll have to drop back to Zoom as our go-to.
But I think it's fair to say we probably don't want to be outside in Minnesota in October. It's a great time of year, but maybe not to sit doing nothing but talking into microphones. Scott, did you have?
I was going to say, I know some people at the Senate, so yeah.
We're counting on you. Any other,
Well, Mr. Chair, I just want to say, because I didn't know this was possible until recently, but I've been teaching an adjunct class at Mitchell Hamlin, and I teach half my students in the classroom in person and half of them remotely on Zoom. And the technology exists if we have the will to figure it out and pay for it. So I think the more of us who realize that that is possible, the better chance we have of getting something like that up and running.
it is preferable to do this if we can, but I'm not going to make you freeze in October. Any other comments? I think we have a couple of public comments.
We had those this morning, unless there's anybody else.
Is there anyone else that was intending to make public comment? Apparently not. Thank you all for your attention in the last couple of days. It was fabulous to see everyone, and I'll look forward to somehow seeing you in October. And the 13th is the date to remember, because Joe will be on your case if you don't get him the information. 4 o'clock, not 4:01.
Do we have a date for a meeting?
Yes, this month. Meeting is adjourned.